From the moment Daniel Harris stepped onto the driveway of his new home, it felt like a chapter from a dream. After years of working long hours as a corporate attorney, he had finally escaped the chaos of the city for a quieter, more peaceful life in the suburbs. The house was everything he'd hoped for: modern, sunlit, and nestled in a cul-de-sac lined with dogwood trees. Neighbors waved from their porches, kids rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and birdsong filled the morning air. It was a picture-perfect postcard of American suburbia. Daniel had chosen this neighborhood with care. It was known for its safety, strong community, and beautifully maintained properties. The local HOA, he'd heard, was efficient and professional, just strict enough to keep the area looking nice, but not so overbearing that it would interfere with personal freedom. At least, that's what the realtor had said. He moved in with the kind of optimism that comes with new beginnings. On weekends, he planted flowers in the front yard and chatted with the neighbors who passed by. There was Mrs. Langford, a retired schoolteacher with a talent for baking, and the Martinez family next door, whose kids always offered to help carry groceries. Everyone seemed warm, polite, and welcoming. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he could finally breathe. But as the weeks went on, he started to notice little things, small cracks in the glossy veneer of suburban harmony. Once, he overheard a neighbor nervously muttering about a warning they received from the HOA for having a flagpole that was too tall. Another time, a man a few doors down seemed to vanish overnight. No goodbye, no for sale sign, just gone. When Daniel asked around, people either shrugged or gave vague answers. He had some issues with the board, someone finally admitted before changing the subject. There was a peculiar sense of quiet compliance that hung over the neighborhood, like everyone was trying a little too hard to stay in line. Still, Daniel didn't think much of it. He chalked it up to suburban politics, the kind of thing people in these neighborhoods obsessed over because they didn't have bigger problems. He focused instead on settling in, bringing in some new furniture, and enjoying his front porch with a cup of coffee in the mornings. Life, for now, was good. But what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that behind those well-manicured lawns and friendly smiles lurked something far more sinister. A force that would soon come knocking, not with a welcome basket, but with threats. And despite all his training, all his courtroom experience, he was about to find out just how dangerous a homeowners association could really be. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It arrived on a Tuesday, just another piece of mail tucked between a grocery flyer and a credit card offer. Daniel wasn't expecting anything important that day, but the envelope stood out. It was stark white with bold black lettering across the front. From the office of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. There was no warmth in it. No welcome to the neighborhood. Just an official seal and a return address that gave it the weight of a summons. Daniel opened it casually, expecting a reminder about trash pickup or a seasonal newsletter, but as he scanned the page, his brow furrowed. The letter was anything but routine. Dear Mr. Harris, this is an official notice of non-compliance regarding your property at 117 Oak Glen Drive. Our records show multiple violations of Willow Ridge HOA community standards, Section 3B, 5A, and 7C. You are required to address these issues within 15 days or face penalties as outlined in our bylaws. That was it. No details, no explanations, just an intimidating list of sections. And a deadline. What violations? Daniel muttered, flipping the letter over as if the answers might be hidden there. Nothing. Just a cold signature from someone named M. Caldwell, HOA board chair. He walked outside and looked around his property. The grass was trimmed, the paint was fresh, and the flower beds he'd worked so hard on looked better than most on the block. He hadn't installed anything new, hadn't altered the exterior in any noticeable way. Everything was by the book, or so he thought. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to get rattled by paperwork. As a lawyer, he'd handled far more serious threats than a homeowner's letter. But something about the tone stuck with him. It wasn't just firm, it was hostile. As if he'd already done something terribly wrong and this was just the beginning of a punishment he hadn't earned. The next day, he called the HOA's office, expecting a quick clarification. Instead, he got voicemail. Twice. On the third call, a clipped voice answered. "This is Willow Ridge HOA. How may I help you?" "Yes, this is Daniel Harris. I received a violation letter, but it didn't specify." "Your concerns have been noted, Mr. Harris. All the information is in the letter. If you have further questions, you can submit them in writing," the voice said, then promptly ended the call. Daniel stood in stunned silence. Noted? Submit in writing? This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. That evening he walked the neighborhood again, this time with sharper eyes. He noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Some houses looked slightly different than others, a bit more modern, freshly renovated. But a pattern was emerging. A quiet trend of homes being pressured, changed, or sold. And always, the HOA was involved. Daniel folded the letter and placed it in a folder. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to let it slide. This wasn't just about his lawn or his shutters. This was about control. And control, he knew all too well, was often just a mask for power. What started as a vague warning letter quickly spiraled into something much more aggressive. Within a week of the first notice, Daniel received a second envelope, this one thicker, more official-looking. Inside was a list of violations that read like a bad joke. His trash bins had been left out too long, by 22 minutes to be exact. The color of his front door wasn't within the HOA's pre-approved palette, and his mailbox was visibly non-compliant with community aesthetics. Each so-called infraction came with a fine totaling over $900. Daniel sat at his dining table. The letters spread out before him like evidence at trial. The ridiculousness of it almost made him laugh. Almost. But what unsettled him wasn't the charges themselves. It was the tone. Cold, clinical, unyielding. He started paying closer attention to the neighborhood, watching for consistency. And that's when the pattern truly emerged. Across the street, a neighbor had mismatched patio furniture and a cracked driveway. No violation. 2 houses down, Christmas lights were still hanging in March. No fine. But Daniel? He'd just repainted his mailbox to match the trim on his house, and that was now a Class B violation, with escalating penalties. It wasn't enforcement. It was targeting. He tried to reach out again, phone calls, emails, even a certified letter requesting a meeting. No one responded. Eventually, he walked to the HOA's tiny office on the edge of the neighborhood. It was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Office hours by appointment only." No contact number, no schedule. But Daniel was a lawyer. If there was one thing he understood, it was documentation and pressure. He started compiling everything. Photos, copies of every letter, a detailed log of attempted communications. He wasn't planning to fight yet, not officially, but he was preparing. Then, one night, things took an even darker turn. Daniel returned home from work to find a red tag hanging on his door, not just a violation notice, but a final warning. It claimed that repeated failure to comply could lead to legal action, or, in the worst-case scenario, a forced sale of his home under Section 9 of the HOA bylaws. He stood on his porch, holding that tag in his hands, his jaw clenched tight. Forced sale? Over a mailbox? Over trash bins? It felt like a threat, and threats only came when someone wanted something. The next morning he walked the neighborhood again, not to clear his head, but to observe. This time he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. 4 houses on his block had recently sold. Quickly. Quietly. No open houses. No listings. Just gone. He knocked on a neighbor's door, Ms. Langford, the retired schoolteacher who once brought him banana bread. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said gently, "but have you noticed anything strange with the HOA lately?" Her expression shifted. Fear. Regret. Then a whisper. "Don't talk too loud. They listen." They? The board. Caldwell and her people. You challenge them, they make your life hell. They want certain people out. The new buyers, most of them are connected. Daniel blinked. Connected to the board? She nodded slowly, eyes darting toward the street. That night, Daniel sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't about garbage cans or paint swatches. This was about control, about money, about power. And he realized something chilling. He wasn't just fighting an HOA. He was fighting a machine. And that machine had no idea who it had just tried to push around. Daniel knew that if he wanted answers, he couldn't go through official channels. The HOA had made it clear. They weren't interested in conversations. They operated from behind paperwork and veiled threats. So he turned to the only real source of truth left. His neighbors. It started with casual chats during morning walks. A nod here, a small compliment on a garden there. Slowly he built rapport, not as a lawyer, but as a fellow resident trying to make sense of the chaos. And it didn't take long before people began to open up. An older man named Ray, who lived a few houses down, pulled Daniel aside one afternoon. "They got my brother-in-law last year," he muttered, voice low. "Hit him with violations every week until he couldn't take it. Sold the house and moved in under 3 months. It was bought by Caldwell's cousin." Caldwell. That name again. Monsieur Caldwell, the chair of the HOA board. The stories kept coming, in fragments and whispers. A young couple forced out after trying to install solar panels. A widower pressured to sell after minor landscaping changes. In every case, the home was quickly scooped up, renovated, and then either sold for a profit or rented out. Most of the buyers? Connected to current or former board members. Daniel's stomach turned. This wasn't incompetence. It was calculated. Digging deeper, he discovered that the HOA held occasional, special meetings, but they weren't publicly announced. No flyers, no community emails. They weren't on the calendar. Only certain residents, mostly those loyal to the board, received invitations. At these gatherings, decisions were made behind closed doors. Fines, code changes, targeted enforcement strategies, all off the record. What stunned Daniel most was that several of the complaints filed against him came from people he'd never even met. He cross-checked the dates on his violation letters with local surveillance cameras, public footage he requested legally. In some cases, he could prove he wasn't even home when the alleged infractions took place. One supposed incident, his porch light being too bright, was cited on a night when he'd been out of town entirely. "They're fabricating reports," he murmured, staring at the timeline he'd built on his computer. "They're setting people up." By now, the folder on his desk had grown thick. He had emails, video stills, time-stamped photos, even voice memos from neighbors afraid to go public. The evidence wasn't just stacking, it was screaming, but Daniel wasn't ready to strike. Not yet, because now that he understood what the HOA was doing, he needed to do something they never expected. He had to beat them at their own game. Quietly, legally, strategically. The HOA had built a network of whispers to control the neighborhood. But now a new whisper was moving through the cul-de-sac, one they didn't see coming. And this one belonged to a man who knew the law like the back of his hand, and had every intention of using it. Daniel had played the part well, quiet, cooperative, a bit rattled but mostly compliant. He trimmed his hedges a little shorter, painted the mailbox beige, even moved his trash bins before the sun went down. To the HOA, it probably looked like he'd finally gotten the message. But behind closed doors, Daniel was building something far more powerful than silence. One evening, while walking his dog, he stopped to chat with Ms. Langford again. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him a Tupperware of leftover cobbler. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They fined me for my wind chimes last week. Said they violated the noise decorum clause." Daniel gave her a reassuring nod. Then, for the first time, he let someone in. "Ms. Langford," he said gently, "I haven't told anyone this yet, but I'm a lawyer. Corporate litigation. For years." Her eyes widened. "I've been documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, emails, even their financial trail. I just need a little more time." For weeks, Daniel had been playing chess while the HOA played checkers. He filed a series of public records requests through the city and county clerk's office, knowing that while HOAs were private entities, their financial dealings, especially if they involved city permits or redevelopment grants, left a paper trail. And sure enough, there it was. Tucked into an overlooked annex of city permit applications was a familiar name, M. Caldwell. But not just as an HOA board chair. She was listed as the registered agent of a small real estate holding company, CW, Property Solutions, LLC. Daniel cross-referenced recent home sales in the neighborhood. 3 of the 5 homes that had changed hands in the last year were sold directly to CW Property Solutions. And all 3 were flipped within 6 months, then sold for nearly double the original price. It wasn't just shady. It was illegal. What the board was doing, using their HOA authority to target homeowners, pressure them with false violations, and then funnel those homes into private investment portfolios, was textbook abuse of power and potentially real estate fraud. Daniel began drafting a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office and the Department of Housing. Not as Daniel Harris, the neighbor who wouldn't repaint his front door, but as Daniel Harris-esque, with evidence, documentation, and legal precedent to back every accusation. He even installed a small camera above his front door, completely legal in the state, to catch any future infractions in real time. 1 week later, it recorded a board member walking onto his property and taking photos of his porch at midnight. He smiled when he watched the footage. Checkmate was getting closer. Still, he said nothing. He showed up to the next HOA community event, shook hands, smiled politely at Caldwell, and accepted a paper plate of barbecue. All while knowing her entire scheme was already falling apart because, while they were busy enforcing rules they didn't follow themselves, Daniel was preparing the kind of blow that couldn't be ignored. The trap was set, and they were already standing in it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Tucked away in the Willow Ridge Community Hall, a space usually reserved for birthday parties and neighborhood cookouts, the HOA had called a special violation review session to determine whether Daniel's repeated non-compliance warranted legal action to force a sale of his property. But Daniel wasn't nervous. He was ready. He arrived 10 minutes early, briefcase in hand, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, just professional enough to remind them who he really was. A few neighbors sat quietly in the back row, unsure of whether they were witnesses or spectators. At the front, the HOA board took their seats behind a folding table dressed with a white plastic tablecloth. At the center, of course, sat Meredith Caldwell. She didn't look at Daniel as he entered. She shuffled papers, whispered to the board, members on either side of her, and sipped from a metal tumbler like she owned the place. Maybe, for a while, she had. The room settled. Caldwell tapped her pen on a clipboard. "Mr. Harris, we're here tonight to review your ongoing violations. After numerous warnings, your property continues to fall outside of HOA standards. We'll now vote on whether the board should proceed with a forced compliance sale as outlined in Section 9. Daniel calmly placed a thick folder on the table before him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'd like to make a brief statement before you vote," he said, his tone smooth but firm. "I believe what I'm about to share will be relevant to everyone in this room." Caldwell narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Harris, this is not a legal proceeding. You were given time to submit written statements." He smiled faintly. "I'm aware. But given that a legal action is being considered against me, it's only fair I exercise my right to respond." And then, he began. One by one, he laid it, all out. Time-stamped photographs proving fabricated violations, camera footage of board members trespassing, official city documents tying Caldwell to CW Property Solutions. He passed out copies of public sales records that showed how 3 recently violating properties had been sold under duress and purchased by her holding company. The room, once tense with scripted control, began to shift. "And just for the record," he added, pulling out a printed HOA disclosure form, "you failed to report this financial interest to the board. As per state HOA law, that's not only unethical, it's a direct violation of your fiduciary duties." A murmur spread through the room, but the real blow came next. Daniel handed over a signed affidavit from a former board member who'd quietly moved away the year before, confirming that the board had met privately to target homeowners deemed problematic. The goal? To drive them out and flip the properties through CW Property Solutions. Caldwell's face lost its color. One of the board members to her left, an older man named Greg, who'd barely spoken the entire time, pushed his chair back slightly. "Is this true, Meredith?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Daniel closed his folder. "I've already submitted this documentation to the State Attorney General's office and the Department of Housing. If you proceed with any action against me, you'll be facing far more than a hearing." Silence. The vote never happened. Instead, Caldwell excused herself from the table and walked out of the room without a word. 2 other board members followed, looking pale and shaken. Daniel stood slowly and turned to the quiet crowd. "If anyone else here has been pressured, fined unfairly, or targeted, I'm happy to help, not as your neighbor, but as your lawyer." For the first time since he moved in, people clapped. It wasn't over yet, but the spell had been broken. The board's reign of fear was cracking, and Daniel had just made the first fracture. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within days of the hearing, murmurs turned into movement. Whispers of what happened that night spread through Willow Ridge like wildfire. People who had been too afraid to speak suddenly found their voices, and they had stories. Stories of years, of intimidation, suspicious fines, and homes lost under pressure. The first board member to resign was Greg. Quiet and soft-spoken, he submitted a typed letter that simply read, "I was not aware of the full extent of the misconduct. I can no longer in good conscience serve on this board." 3 others followed within the week. The once ironclad HOA structure began to unravel, thread by thread. And at the center of it all was Meredith Caldwell, whose calm facade had shattered. The night of the hearing, Daniel heard from a neighbor that Caldwell had been seen pacing outside her home, on the phone for hours, arguing, desperate. Another claimed she'd hired a lawyer of her own, but Daniel wasn't backing down. He filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Housing, and the local real estate commission. He sent them everything: the forged violations, the shell company documents, the financial ties. He knew how this game worked. Paperwork was power, and he had it in spades. Within weeks, the Attorney General's office opened an investigation into the HOA. A formal inquiry was launched into CW Property Solutions for conflict of interest, fraudulent acquisition of properties, and financial misconduct. Caldwell was served with a subpoena. Her company bank accounts were frozen pending review. And still, Daniel pressed forward. He organized a legal aid session in the community center for any homeowner who'd been affected. People came, nervous at first, then emboldened. Some cried, while recounting their stories. Some brought folders of their own, fines, threats, pictures. Daniel listened to each one, taking notes, asking questions, explaining their rights. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was dismantling a system that had thrived on fear. The neighborhood transformed. Lawns that had once been trimmed to perfection with military precision now bloomed with wildflowers. Wind chimes returned to porches. Garden gnomes reappeared. People waved again, talked again. They no longer looked over their shoulders. Daniel had done more than win a battle. He'd exposed a war no one knew was being waged, but as the legal machine turned and the HOA's grip collapsed, he remained focused. He knew these things didn't end cleanly. There would be appeals, loopholes, delays. So he stayed ready, because when the law was on your side, patience wasn't a burden. It was a weapon. And Daniel had no intention of laying his down. 6 months later, the neighborhood looked different, but this time in all the right ways. The old HOA board had been fully dissolved, replaced by a newly elected group of residents who believed in fairness, transparency, and community over control. Meredith Caldwell was under formal investigation, her real estate scheme now public knowledge. Her home, once a symbol of her authority, had a "for sale" sign posted at the curb, faded and ignored. Daniel still lived in the same 2-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac, but now it felt like his home in every way. No more anonymous letters tucked under his door. No more bogus citations or midnight photos. Just peace. And in his front yard, where once a plain patch of grass had existed, there bloomed something new. A garden. Lavender, rosemary, and bright red poppies lined the stone path. At the center stood a small, hand-carved wooden plaque nestled between the flowers. It read, "Planted in freedom, grown in resilience." Neighbors stopped by often now, some to admire the garden, others just to chat. Ms. Langford brought over homemade lemonade on warm afternoons, and the Thompsons from across the street helped him install a new bird feeder. They remembered what he did, not just the courtroom logic or legal takedowns, but the fact that he stood up when others couldn't. And Daniel? He never once regretted staying, because some houses are just places, but others are worth fighting for. And this one, in this little neighborhood once ruled by fear, had become something rare. Home. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.